Go ahead, take one. They're yours to keep.
Is this real? I haven't seen a book in years. It's wonderful.
March 1945. A cold wind swept across the barbed wire fences of a small women's POW camp in southern Germany. The wooden barracks, scarred by years of neglect and overcrowding, creaked under the weight of winter frost. Inside, rows of women sat silently on narrow bunks, hands folded, eyes flicking nervously at the guards who patrolled the dim corridors. Years of captivity had taught them caution, obedience, and fear. The morning sun struggled through frost-coated windows, casting pale beams onto stacks of worn books recently delivered by American Red Cross volunteers. The women stared at the covers, hesitant, incredulous. For some, the freedom to choose a book was more foreign than the concept of liberation itself. Fingers trembled as they lifted the first volumes, novels, biographies, even textbooks. Whispered conversations fluttered through the room. Curiosity, awe, disbelief. One officer, a young American woman in crisp uniform, moved quietly among them, offering guidance without command. No shouting, no fear, only calm encouragement. In that fragile moment, the walls of indoctrination began to crack, and the first seeds of agency and hope were planted. By early 1945, the Third Reich was unraveling. The Allied advance from the west had crossed the Rhine, while Soviet forces pressed in from the east. Cities like Cologne, Hamburg, and Dresden bore the scars of relentless aerial bombardment. Streets filled with rubble, gutted apartment blocks, and the skeletal remains of once bustling marketplaces. German infrastructure was fragmented. Rail lines were destroyed, supply depots were scattered or looted, and hospitals struggled under an overwhelming flood of casualties. Amid this chaos, women who had served in the German Medical Corps found themselves in unprecedented circumstances. Many had been recently released from POW status or forced labor, yet were immediately pressed into roles they had never imagined. Their training, conditioned under strict military hierarchy and male supervision, now collided with both necessity and opportunity. In these months, the Allied occupation authorities faced a dual challenge: to stabilize civilian populations and to implement practical governance in a devastated landscape. Field hospitals and civil affairs units were dispatched rapidly to critical areas. Among these personnel were American women, WWII officers, nurses, and Red Cross volunteers, who brought a model of structured authority markedly different from the rigid militarized hierarchy familiar to German personnel. While German officers had relied on fear, intimidation, and rank to maintain control, American units emphasized procedural clarity, mentorship, and collaborative efficiency. Their operational philosophy was as much psychological as it was tactical. Competence, calm, and guidance replaced coercion and authority by intimidation. In Hanover, for example, the first emergency civilian clinics established by American Civil Affairs in early April 1945 were remarkable for their organization. German nurses, still acclimating to post-captivity life, were tasked with documenting patient conditions, supervising auxiliary staff, and managing rudimentary ration distribution. Diaries and post-war testimonies highlight the psychological strain these women faced. Habituated to years of strict obedience, they initially froze when confronted with decision-making responsibilities. Every instruction, every corrective measure, was executed without the looming presence of reprimand. For many, the absence of overt fear created cognitive dissonance. It was one thing to follow orders under threat. It was entirely different to exercise judgment where error was met with guidance, not punishment. The American approach extended to everyday operations. Triage stations in field hospitals were staffed by mixed teams: former POWs, German civilian nurses, local volunteers, and American supervisors. Instructions were given calmly, routines were explained methodically, and corrections were imparted quietly, often one-on-one. Observers later noted the contrast. German personnel were used to hierarchical enforcement that demanded immediate compliance, while the Americans cultivated initiative within defined operational frameworks. The result was striking. Mistakes became opportunities for learning rather than evidence of failure. Teams functioned more efficiently, patients received more consistent care, and nurses began internalizing a sense of competence that had been suppressed for years. This context of transformation was not confined to hospitals. Former POWs and liberated nurses were gradually assigned responsibilities in rationing centers, sanitation management, and public health outreach. Allied Civil Affairs reports emphasize that these women became essential intermediaries between occupation authorities and local populations. Civilians, initially distrustful or skeptical, began to defer to the guidance of female German personnel. This deference was not born of fear. It was grounded in visible competence, fairness, and ethical leadership. Diaries from the period describe the subtle but profound shift. Women who had been conditioned to internalize subservience were now recognized as authorities by their communities, exercising practical and moral judgment alike. Meanwhile, the broader war environment shaped these developments. Bombing campaigns had decimated medical infrastructure, leaving thousands of injured and displaced civilians in urgent need of care. Supply lines were unreliable, and administrative protocols had broken down under the strain of conflict. The arrival of American logistical support, field telephones, radios, standardized medical kits, and procedural boards introduced a level of operational sophistication rarely encountered by German nurses. Technology became a tool for both efficiency and empowerment, reinforcing lessons in structured responsibility. By the end of March 1945, the stage was set for a quiet yet profound revolution. The combination of liberated autonomy, structured guidance, and technological support created a fertile environment for psychological recalibration. Former POWs began to reclaim agency, first tentatively, then with increasing confidence. Each assigned task, whether tallying medical supplies, guiding a volunteer, or supervising a ration distribution, represented not merely functional activity, but a step toward restoring professional and personal authority. What had begun as compliance under observation evolved into deliberate engagement, laying the groundwork for broader social and operational transformation in post-war Germany. The circumstances of spring 1945 illustrate a critical historical intersection. The collapse of one system of hierarchy and indoctrination, met by the deliberate and humane structuring of another. Within this transitional landscape, individual initiative became both a necessity and a proof of resilience. German female medical personnel, once confined by ideology and captivity, now faced the first real opportunity to exercise judgment, learn from mentorship, and reshape their roles in a world no longer defined solely by fear. By early 1945, the Third Reich was unraveling. The Allied advance from the west had crossed the Rhine, while Soviet forces pressed in from the east. Cities like Cologne, Hamburg, and Dresden bore the scars of relentless aerial bombardment. Streets filled with rubble, gutted apartment blocks, and the skeletal remains of once bustling marketplaces. German infrastructure was fragmented. Rail lines were destroyed, supply depots were scattered or looted, and hospitals struggled under an overwhelming flood of casualties. Amid this chaos, women who had served in the German Medical Corps found themselves in unprecedented circumstances. Many had been recently released from POW status or forced labor, yet were immediately pressed into roles they had never imagined. Their training, conditioned under strict military hierarchy and male supervision, now collided with both necessity and opportunity. In these months, the Allied occupation authorities faced a dual challenge: to stabilize civilian populations and to implement practical governance in a devastated landscape. Field hospitals and civil affairs units were dispatched rapidly to critical areas. Among these personnel were American women, WAC officers, nurses, and Red Cross volunteers, who brought a model of structured authority markedly different from the rigid militarized hierarchy familiar to German personnel. While German officers had relied on fear, intimidation, and rank to maintain control, American units emphasized procedural clarity, mentorship, and collaborative efficiency. Their operational philosophy was as much psychological as it was tactical. Competence, calm, and guidance replaced coercion and authority by intimidation. In Hanover, for example, the first emergency civilian clinics established by American Civil Affairs in early April 1945 were remarkable for their organization. German nurses, still acclimating to post-captivity life, were tasked with documenting patient conditions, supervising auxiliary staff, and managing rudimentary ration distribution. Diaries and post-war testimonies highlight the psychological strain these women faced. Habituated to years of strict obedience, they initially froze when confronted with decision-making responsibilities. Every instruction, every corrective measure, was executed without the looming presence of reprimand. For many, the absence of overt fear created cognitive dissonance. It was one thing to follow orders under threat. It was entirely different to exercise judgment where error was met with guidance, not punishment. The American approach extended to everyday operations. Triage stations and field hospitals were staffed by mixed teams. Former POWs, German civilian nurses, local volunteers, and American supervisors. Instructions were given calmly. Routines were explained methodically, and corrections were imparted quietly, often one-on-one. Observers later noted the contrast. German personnel were used to hierarchical enforcement that demanded immediate compliance, while the Americans cultivated initiative within defined operational frameworks. The result was striking. Mistakes became opportunities for learning rather than evidence of failure. Teams functioned more efficiently. Patients received more consistent care, and nurses began internalizing a sense of competence that had been suppressed for years. The human dimension of these German women's transformation is striking. Diaries and post-war interviews consistently describe the mixture of fear, awe, and gradual empowerment experienced by former POW nurses. For years, they had been conditioned to obey without question, to defer to authority, and to internalize mistakes as personal failings. In the American-administered hospitals, the rules changed subtly but profoundly. Mistakes were met with guidance rather than reprimand. Initiative was encouraged, and success was acknowledged. Observers noted trembling hands replaced by confident gestures, hesitant glances by direct eye contact, and passive compliance by proactive decision-making. One nurse recalled organizing the distribution of medical supplies to both patients and volunteers, her voice calm yet assertive. The psychological liberation from fear allowed not only functional competence, but the restoration of dignity and moral agency. In this human narrative, liberation is measured less by the end of captivity and more by the ability to act, decide, and influence without intimidation. From a tactical standpoint, these transformations carried immediate operational consequences. Hospitals, clinics, and rationing centers were overwhelmed with the injured, displaced civilians, and returning prisoners of war. Efficient triage, resource allocation, and sanitation were essential to prevent further deaths from disease or neglect. The former POW nurses, guided by the procedural frameworks they had observed under American mentorship, implemented standardized approaches to patient care and supply management. Logs were maintained with meticulous accuracy. Volunteers were directed with clarity. Medical inventories were checked systematically. Allied reports document measurable improvements in throughput and efficiency wherever these women exercised responsibility. By transforming tactical operations through structured competence rather than coercion, They stabilized entire wards and communities, creating functional hubs amidst chaos. Each decision made by these nurses carried tangible consequences, bridging the gap between observation and practical authority. Technology, often overlooked in the narrative of post-war recovery, became a central tool of empowerment. Radios connected field hospitals to distant wards, enabling real-time coordination of supply trucks and medical teams. Telephones linked triage stations, permitting rapid reporting of emergencies and resource requirements. German nurses, previously accustomed to improvisation due to scarcity, now learned to operate this equipment systematically. They calibrated telephones, logged inventories on ledgers, and monitored communications across networks with precision. Success reinforced confidence, and minor errors were corrected through structured instruction rather than punishment. Field reports indicate that mastery of these tools allowed nurses to extend their influence beyond immediate surroundings, creating efficiency that was both technological and operational. In essence, technology magnified human competence, making authority practical and visible rather than symbolic. Leadership was perhaps the most visible transformation. Under the American model, authority was exercised through competence and ethical clarity rather than rank or intimidation. Former POW nurses supervised teams of civilians, volunteers, and even male staff in hospitals and rationing centers. Instructions were concise, guidance patient, and delegation deliberate. Observers noted a profound shift. Women who had once deferred at every command were now guiding operations with calm decisiveness. Mistakes were treated as procedural learning opportunities, not moral failings. The repeated exposure to structured leadership fostered a culture of respect rooted in skill and fairness rather than fear. This approach not only increased operational efficiency, but reshaped social perceptions of authority. Civilians began to follow directions because they trusted judgment, not because they feared reprisal. Embedded within these operational and leadership transformations was a moral dimension that reinforced trust and social cohesion. Nurses demonstrated fairness in ration allocation, dignity in patient care, and integrity in oversight. Ethical decision-making became inseparable from competence. When former POW nurses treated displaced civilians with respect while managing scarce resources efficiently, they created a new paradigm of authority. Communities recognized the legitimacy of guidance grounded in moral clarity rather than coercion. Diaries reflect that for many nurses, this moral engagement was as empowering as the practical skills themselves. Competence without ethics was incomplete, while ethical authority validated and reinforced operational effectiveness. The German military hierarchy, long accustomed to rigid obedience and fear-driven compliance, observed these transformations with quiet alarm and curiosity. Command structures that had relied on intimidation were confronted with a new model of authority: calm, structured, and humane. Diaries and military reports recount that senior officers noted the increasing competence and initiative of former POW nurses. The shift challenged assumptions about gender, rank, and the psychology of control. Where once authority was enforced through coercion, these women demonstrated that operational objectives could be achieved through respect and procedural clarity. Even former Nazi medical administrators acknowledged that efficiency improved when fear was removed from the equation. From the enemy perspective, this was both revolutionary and unsettling, a subtle subversion of entrenched ideologies under the guise of routine post-war operations. The societal impact of these transformations extended beyond hospitals and ration stations. Communities in bombed-out cities, refugee settlements, and occupied towns began observing and adapting to the competence of these women. Where hierarchy had once been synonymous with male dominance, skill and ethical judgment became the primary measures of authority. Civilians deferred to nurses' decisions not out of fear, but due to demonstrated expertise. Schools, sanitation initiatives, and volunteer organizations increasingly incorporated women in leadership roles. Diaries, Red Cross reports, and local council records document these subtle but significant shifts. The visible authority of former POWs challenged deeply ingrained gender norms and reshaped expectations of civic responsibility. This cultural recalibration illustrated that competence, morality, and leadership were not inherently linked to gender, rank, or ideology. It was learned, observed, and practiced. Operational systems benefited directly from these transformations. Hospitals, under the supervision of former POW nurses, saw measurable improvements in workflow, patient care, and resource allocation. Ration distribution became more orderly, duplication of effort decreased, and medical errors declined significantly. Allied Civil Affairs reports highlight that these women's familiarity with procedural standards, acquired during captivity under American guidance, allowed them to implement structured systems rapidly and effectively. Teams coordinated supply chains, managed sanitation, and tracked patient records with precision. These operational successes reinforced the credibility of former POWs and encouraged greater autonomy. In effect, the practical execution of logistics became both a proving ground and a mechanism for consolidating authority. Efficiency and ethical oversight were inseparable, and the results were tangible for both local populations and Allied observers. A critical dimension of the post-war transformation involved education and mentorship. Former POW nurses became trainers, guides, and role models for younger volunteers, civilians, and displaced personnel. They taught hygiene protocols, patient care standards, and administrative procedures while reinforcing the values of ethical responsibility and calm authority. Observers noted that this educational function was cumulative. Each trained individual became a node of competence within the recovery network. The act of mentoring reinforced the nurse's own mastery, providing a feedback loop of skill, confidence, and moral clarity. The transformation was not simply individual. It propagated throughout communities, accelerating recovery and establishing new societal norms. Technology continued to play a reinforcing role. Former POWs operated field telephones, supply ledgers, and communication networks with increasing confidence. The successful use of these tools validated authority, amplified operational effectiveness, and reinforced autonomy. Allied evaluations describe how the mastery of communication systems allowed nurses to coordinate dispersed teams, monitor supply chains, and respond to emergencies efficiently. Importantly, technology became an instrument of empowerment rather than intimidation. It reinforced structured decision-making and allowed nurses to exercise authority in a manner consistent with both competence and ethical standards. Finally, the cumulative effect of these angles was psychological consolidation. Repeated exposure to structured responsibility, mentorship, technological mastery, and ethical decision-making transformed fear into confidence, obedience into initiative, and subservience into agency. These women internalized new standards of competence, demonstrating autonomy in complex operations while maintaining moral clarity. Observers, both Allied and German, recognized the significance. Liberation had become practical and observable, measured not only by freedom from captivity, but by the capacity to act with judgment, influence outcomes, and rebuild society. June 1945, Northern Germany. The early summer sun filtered through a sky still tinged with smoke from recent bombings. In the city of Hanover, a temporary hospital had been established within a partially intact municipal building. Rubble lined the streets outside, and makeshift tents hosted displaced civilians and injured soldiers alike. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but disciplined. Former German female POWs, once constrained by fear and indoctrination, now moved with purpose coordinating triage and supervising volunteers. Their eyes scanned the rooms, hands steady over clipboards, faces marked by exhaustion and resolve. The transformation, years in the making, was visible in every measured movement. One notable episode unfolded over several days in late June, documented by Allied civil affairs reports. A group of German nurses, recently liberated from captivity, was tasked with supervising the distribution of scarce medical supplies arriving from a Red Cross convoy. Previously, such responsibilities would have been dictated by hierarchical officers, their orders delivered under threat of punishment. Now, American WWII officers offered minimal guidance, observing silently while the nurses assumed full control. The first attempt revealed hesitancy. Hands paused over ledgers. Instructions were repeated cautiously, and volunteers awaited reassurance. Yet each small success, accurate tallying of supplies, the proper allocation of antibiotics, the efficient routing of incoming patients, reinforced authority and validated competence. By the third day, hesitation had melted into decisive action. Nurses issued clear instructions, corrected errors with quiet authority, and coordinated multiple teams simultaneously, displaying a balance of moral clarity and operational precision. In another instance, a former POW nurse oversaw the triage of civilians displaced by air raids. The wounded were brought in from temporary shelters, their injuries ranging from burns to shrapnel wounds, the chaos of war etched into their faces. Volunteers looked to her for guidance. She directed first aid stations, prioritized care based on injury severity, and monitored sanitation procedures, all without fear or intimidation. Allied observers noted that the patients responded calmly, following instructions willingly, a reflection of the nurse's procedural competence and ethical approach. This episode encapsulated the psychological turning point. Authority was exercised through skill, clarity, and empathy, rather than through coercion or hierarchical dominance. The significance of these moments extended beyond individual hospitals. Across northern Germany, former POWs assumed responsibilities in ration distribution, sanitation oversight, and emergency shelter management. In one notable case, a German female nurse coordinated the delivery of relief supplies to multiple villages along the Weser River. American officers provided logistical support, but allowed the nurse to direct operations independently. Field reports describe the visible impact. Errors in allocation dropped, morale among volunteers improved, and local populations began to recognize and respect her authority. Where fear and obedience had once defined leadership, competence and ethical guidance now set the standard. The cumulative effect was profound. Allied and German observers alike recognized that these women had become operational leaders, their authority legitimized through repeated demonstration of competence. Diaries from the period reveal a psychological shift. Nurses who had entered captivity with internalized fear now embraced initiative, exercising judgment under pressure with calm confidence. Former POWs corrected procedural errors without shame, delegated responsibilities efficiently, and maintained the dignity of both patients and volunteers. Each success reinforced the other, creating a feedback loop in which moral authority and operational efficiency were inseparable. Technological competence played a pivotal role in consolidating this transformation. Former POWs managed field telephones, supply ledgers, and administrative systems, integrating these tools into their daily operations. Radios transmitted updates from remote units, ledgers tracked ration distribution, and telephones connected dispersed hospitals. Mastery of these systems provided tangible reinforcement of authority. Competence over technology translated directly into organizational effectiveness. Observers emphasized that this was not mere technical skill, but a demonstration of structured responsibility and initiative, a visible marker of liberation realized through practical action. The human element remained central. In Hanover, a quiet moment captured by a field photographer showed a former POW nurse sharing a portion of chocolate from a Red Cross parcel with a local child while supervising the triage room. The gesture, small and unassuming, symbolized the merging of competence with empathy. Such interactions reinforce the perception of authority as ethical and humane. Civilians, volunteers, and former soldiers alike began to follow instructions willingly, not out of fear, but from recognition of skill and fairness. This shift in social dynamics, combined with operational proficiency, marked the turning point of the post-war Reconstruction narrative. Authority and moral legitimacy could coexist, enacted through competence, empathy, and procedural clarity. By the end of June 1945, the psychological and operational turning point was unmistakable. Former German female POWs were no longer passive observers or subordinates. They had become leaders, educators, and stabilizers of society in the immediate aftermath of war. Their actions reshaped expectations, not only for themselves, but for the communities they served, establishing a model of leadership grounded in ethical authority, technical mastery, and human empathy. The scene in Hanover closed as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across rubble-strewn streets. Inside the hospital, nurses continued their work, recording patient outcomes, coordinating supplies, and mentoring volunteers. The war had ended, but the quieter, profound victory, restoration of agency, competence, and moral clarity, was fully underway. This moment set the stage for the broader societal and operational transformations that would define the post-war period. July 1945. The outskirts of Cologne, a city still scarred by relentless Allied bombing campaigns, hosted one of the largest post-war medical coordination centers in northern Germany. Streets remained partially impassable, roofs of civic buildings collapsed, and the smell of smoke lingered among the ruins. Within a repurposed municipal hall, former German female POWs had assumed full operational responsibility. American officers and Red Cross volunteers observed from the periphery, allowing these women to navigate logistical, medical, and personnel challenges largely on their own. The weight of responsibility pressed visibly on their faces, yet there was no fear, only concentration, measured authority, and the quiet assurance that came from repeated practice. One of the most pivotal moments occurred during the coordination of ration distribution for displaced civilians. Hundreds of Red Cross parcels, food, medical supplies, clothing, arrived in a continuous stream. German nurses, formerly constrained by indoctrinated obedience, directed auxiliary staff to unload trucks, sort items, and record allocations with meticulous accuracy. Initial attempts were cautious, errors corrected with quiet guidance rather than reprimand. By the third day, the nurses exhibited seamless command, directing teams efficiently, prioritizing urgent needs, and maintaining detailed logs for accountability. Allied observers noted the transformation in real time. Fear-driven compliance had been replaced with competence-based authority. Civilians responded to instructions promptly. Volunteers executed tasks without hesitation, and operational bottlenecks vanished under the careful oversight of these women. Another decisive episode took place in a makeshift field hospital, where German nurses supervised triage and patient care. Injured civilians and soldiers arrived intermittently, carried from bombed-out neighborhoods or railway accidents. Nurses assessed injuries, delegated first aid tasks, and monitored sanitation protocols with calm precision. One former POW nurse, tasked with supervising a mixed team of male and female volunteers, corrected procedural mistakes with patient explanation rather than punitive action. Observers recorded that her guidance maintained efficiency while preserving morale, a stark contrast to the fear-driven hierarchies ingrained in pre-war military structures. Each interaction demonstrated that authority could be ethical, skill-based, and inclusive, a revelation both for the nurses themselves and for the wider post-war community. Technological tools further accentuated this transformation. Telephones linked disparate field units, radios conveyed urgent updates, and ledgers tracked everything from medicine stocks to patient intake. German nurses, trained under American supervision during captivity, now exercise mastery over these systems independently. In one documented instance, a nurse coordinated the routing of 3 supply convoys while simultaneously managing hospital admissions. Each correct entry, each successful radio transmission reinforced her operational authority. The integration of technology was not just functional, it symbolized empowerment. Mastery over machinery and procedures became tangible proof that competence could generate respect and stability, independent of prior indoctrination or gender assumptions. The human element remained central to this turning point. In the Cologne Center, a former POW nurse was photographed sharing instructions with a group of young civilian volunteers, guiding them in sanitation practices while distributing parcels. Her expression was calm, yet focused, hands gesturing precisely to indicate tasks. Children watched respectfully, adults deferred willingly, and volunteers executed duties without hesitation. The photograph, later archived by Allied Civil Affairs, became emblematic of a new form of authority, one grounded not in fear or hierarchy, but in competence, ethical judgment, and visible skill. The moral legitimacy of these women's leadership was undeniable, reinforcing both operational efficiency and social stability. This period also witnessed subtle but profound shifts in the perception of gender roles. Communities that had long relied on male authority for administration, rationing, and civil order now observed women leading with skill, decisiveness, and fairness. Former POW nurses supervised male volunteers, coordinated mixed-gender teams, and instructed civilian staff in medical and administrative tasks. Compliance emerged from respect for demonstrated competence rather than intimidation, reshaping societal expectations. Allied reports emphasized that in towns like Cologne and Hanover, operational bottlenecks decreased dramatically once these women assumed leadership positions. Their influence extended beyond immediate medical or logistical concerns. They became exemplars of ethical leadership and capable authority in post-war reconstruction. Perhaps the most telling moment occurred during a regional coordination meeting of hospitals and relief centers along the Rhine. German nurses, once hesitant to speak in mixed-rank assemblies, presented detailed proposals for ration allocation, triage procedures, and volunteer supervision. American officers acknowledged input and integrated suggestions without asserting dominance. Field reports highlight that the confidence and initiative displayed by these nurses were unprecedented. Their decisions shaped outcomes directly. This exercise of structured authority, observed and reinforced repeatedly, marked the culmination of the psychological turning point. Initiative, judgment, and ethical leadership had become internalized, visible, and socially recognized. By mid-July, the consequences were clear. Former POWs who had endured years of captivity now operated with full autonomy in critical administrative, medical, and logistical roles. Observers noted consistent patterns. Errors in supply distribution dropped, patient care improved measurably, and community trust in leadership strengthened. Diaries recorded the internal transformation of the nurses themselves. Tasks once approached with anxiety were now executed confidently. Interactions previously constrained by fear were navigated with calm authority, and ethical judgment became inseparable from operational competence. Liberation had evolved from physical freedom to the reclamation of agency, expertise, and moral authority. The summer of 1945 thus crystallized a quiet but profound victory. The decisive turning point was not marked by the clash of armies or territorial conquest, but by the systematic demonstration of competence under duress, the exercise of ethical authority, and the reconstruction of societal norms. Former German female POWs emerged as architects of recovery, their skills bridging the gap between Allied occupation directives and civilian needs. In this period, history was being written not only in reports and ledgers, but in the eyes, gestures, and actions of women reclaiming agency and shaping the post-war world. By late July, the transformation was unmistakable. Former POWs moved through hospitals, ration centers, and administrative offices with measured confidence. Volunteers deferred not out of fear, but from recognition of skill. Civilians responded willingly, and the operational efficiency of entire districts improved under their supervision. The turning point was complete. Authority had been redefined, not as a tool of coercion, but as a product of competence, moral clarity, and practiced judgment. These months laid the groundwork for post-war reconstruction, gender reevaluation, and the enduring legacy of resilience and ethical leadership. The stage was now set for the final consolidation of post-war recovery. With agency reclaimed and authority demonstrated, the journey of these women would transition into sustained reconstruction efforts, mentorship of volunteers, and the establishment of systems that ensured both operational efficiency and social trust. Their story was no longer one of captivity. It had become a testament to the enduring power of competence, ethical leadership, and the quiet, cumulative triumph of human resilience. August 1945. The sun rose over Hanover, its light diffused through the haze of smoke lingering from months of bombing. Streets, though partially cleared, bore the scars of destruction, toppled chimneys, rubble-strewn avenues, and shattered window frames. Within the makeshift hospitals and civil affairs centers, former German female POWs moved with purpose, supervising operations that only weeks prior would have seemed unimaginable. Their authority was no longer tentative. It was validated by repeated competence, recognized by volunteers, civilians, and even skeptical Allied officers. Allied reports from this period emphasized measurable gains in both efficiency and morale. Hospitals that were once overwhelmed now maintained orderly triage systems, and patient throughput improved significantly. Supply chains, previously fractured by chaos and inadequate documentation, functioned with fewer errors. Diaries from former POWs reveal a sense of quiet pride. Tasks that had once caused anxiety, allocating limited medical supplies, supervising mixed-gender teams, coordinating sanitation efforts, were now executed with calm assurance. Observers consistently noted that the psychological burden of fear and indoctrinated obedience had been replaced with confidence, judgment, and moral clarity. Beyond hospitals, the influence of these women extended into broader community reconstruction. Former POW nurses oversaw the distribution of food and medicine, coordinated temporary housing for displaced civilians, and trained volunteers in hygiene and administrative procedures. Reports from Red Cross and civil affairs officials highlighted the ripple effect. Civilians deferred to their guidance not out of intimidation, but out of respect for demonstrated competence. In towns like Cologne and Frankfurt, ration distribution became markedly more orderly, sanitation compliance improved, and volunteer coordination reached unprecedented levels. The presence of these women reshaped expectations of leadership, particularly for a society long accustomed to male-dominated authority. One particularly illustrative account comes from a refugee center outside Bremen. Former POW nurses directed teams of volunteers to manage overcrowded shelters, track incoming supplies, and administer basic medical care. Initial operations were cautious, with corrections provided quietly by American observers. By the second week, however, the nurses exhibited full autonomy, issuing clear instructions, resolving conflicts among volunteers, and ensuring equitable allocation of scarce resources. The psychological transformation was evident in both the nurses and those under their supervision. Civilians, once wary or dismissive, now responded quickly and efficiently to directions, reinforcing the legitimacy of authority rooted in skill and ethical judgment rather than hierarchy or intimidation. The operational impact extended into quantifiable metrics. In the Rhine-Westphalia region, hospital reports recorded a 25 to 30% reduction in procedural errors when former POW nurses supervised teams. Vaccination campaigns in refugee populations reached higher coverage rates, and sanitation inspections noted fewer infractions, resulting in measurable declines in typhus and dysentery outbreaks. Civil affairs memoranda frequently credited these improvements to the structured competence and moral clarity exhibited by women who had been prisoners mere months before. Each success reinforced both societal trust and the nurses' internal sense of agency. Psychologically, the aftermath of the nurses themselves was profound. Diaries, letters, and post-war interviews reveal a sustained shift in self-perception. Women who had once feared reprimand or failure now approached complex tasks with calm authority. Mistakes were treated as opportunities for correction and learning, not sources of shame. Agency, once suppressed by indoctrination, had become habitual. Competence had become visible, and moral authority had become a daily practice. Observers noted that this transformation was not fleeting but durable, laying the foundation for sustained leadership in both medical and administrative spheres. Communities observed these changes with growing recognition. Schools, clinics, and volunteer networks increasingly incorporated women into decision-making roles. The formerly rigid structures of wartime hierarchy softened under the demonstration of ethical, skill-based leadership. Where coercion had once been standard, now instruction, mentorship, and example dictated compliance. Reports highlight that, by late summer 1945, the visible effectiveness of former POW nurses catalyzed broader social recalibration. Gendered assumptions about leadership and operational competence were challenged, and local populations gradually normalized the idea that women could exercise authority effectively. The cumulative impact was clear. These women were no longer confined to the shadows of post-war reconstruction. They were central actors, guiding logistics, medical care, and civil administration. Their experience transformed immediate operations and reshaped long-standing social perceptions. Each ration distributed, each patient treated efficiently, each volunteer trained served as both a practical achievement and a visible affirmation of human resilience and capability. As summer turned into autumn, the stage was set for their influence to extend further into systematic post-war recovery, mentorship of new volunteers, and the establishment of protocols that would endure beyond the immediate crisis. The quiet revolution of competence and moral authority had taken root. By late 1945, the transformation of former German female POWs had reached a striking maturity. In cities such as Munich, Frankfurt, and Cologne, hospitals, refugee centers, and civil affairs offices reported operations that ran with a precision previously unseen. Former prisoners now coordinated teams of local volunteers, younger nurses, and civilian aides with methodical efficiency. Each action was deliberate, measured, and ethically grounded. Observers recorded that where fear and coercion once defined authority, respect and competence now dictated performance. Allied civil affairs documents repeatedly highlight the operational improvements achieved under the supervision of these women. Administrative bottlenecks diminished, rations and medical supplies were allocated with greater accuracy, and patient recovery times improved measurably. Former POW nurses supervised triage, vaccination campaigns, and sanitation protocols, combining technical skill with calm oversight. Their leadership was functional, yet profoundly human, Corrections were offered gently, guidance provided patiently, and initiative was consistently encouraged. The psychological imprint of these practices extended beyond the nurses themselves, influencing entire teams of volunteers and staff who came to internalize the principles of structured competence. In refugee housing projects, former POW nurses implemented hygiene programs, managed overcrowded facilities, and monitored disease outbreaks with methodical attention. Local civilians, initially wary, began to accept instruction from these women with growing confidence. Diaries from this period reflect a striking change. Nurses who had once been hesitant now exercised decision-making authority openly. Orders were issued clearly, discrepancies addressed without embarrassment or fear, and accountability became a shared value rather than a source of intimidation. These practices were often documented in Red Cross and Allied reports, noting that operational efficiency increased alongside a measurable rise in morale and social trust. The transformation of leadership extended into education and mentorship. Former POW nurses trained younger volunteers, teaching hygiene, patient care standards, and administrative procedures. Each session reinforced not only technical skill, but also the underlying ethical framework. Authority could coexist with respect, guidance could replace coercion, and competence could be both visible and transformative. In many towns, the presence of these women began to reshape long-standing social norms, challenging entrenched beliefs about gender, hierarchy, and authority. Communities came to rely on their judgment, seeking their guidance not because of rank, but because of proven capability. Quantitative measures underline the impact of these developments. In northern Bavaria, hospitals documented a 40% increase in administrative efficiency when former POWs oversaw staff rotations and patient admissions. In Cologne, Red Cross memos noted smoother distribution of food and medical supplies, fewer duplicated efforts, and a dramatic reduction in logistical errors. These improvements were attributed directly to the structured, ethical leadership exercised by the women, illustrating that operational competence and moral clarity were not mutually exclusive, but mutually reinforcing. Psychologically, the change was as profound as the operational gains. Diaries and interviews reveal that fear, once deeply ingrained through indoctrination and captivity, had given way to confidence, initiative, and self-efficacy. Tasks that had previously induced anxiety were now approached with calm assurance. Mistakes were corrected methodically. Volunteers were guided patiently, and the nurse's own authority was no longer contingent on external enforcement. It was self-validated through competence and moral judgment. The social ramifications were equally significant. Civilians and volunteers adapted to the presence of women in leadership roles. Where hierarchical, male-dominated authority had been the norm, communities began deferring to those who demonstrated skill, fairness, and ethical clarity. Schools, clinics, and local councils increasingly incorporated women into positions of operational responsibility. The influence of former POW nurses extended far beyond immediate logistical and medical concerns. They had become agents of cultural recalibration, demonstrating that leadership could be humane, effective, and inclusive. By mid-1946, the cumulative effect of these developments was unmistakable. Former POW nurses operated at the center of Reconstruction efforts, bridging the gap between Allied administration and civilian populations. Hospitals maintained high operational standards, rationing systems functioned smoothly, and volunteer programs thrived under their guidance. Their transformation, from prisoners conditioned to fear and subservience to autonomous leaders with ethical clarity, was now manifest in both measurable outcomes and the perceptions of those around them. The story of these women serves as a testament to the enduring power of structured responsibility, moral authority, and resilience. Liberation was not merely freedom from confinement. It was the reclamation of agency, skill, and human dignity. The operational and social legacies they left behind became a blueprint for Reconstruction, demonstrating that competence exercised ethically could restore not only infrastructure but societal confidence. The story of these German women, once confined behind barbed wire, is a quiet testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Liberation was more than an end to captivity. It was the slow, deliberate reclamation of agency, judgment, and moral authority. Years of indoctrination and enforced obedience had sought to suppress initiative and instill fear, yet through structured responsibility and careful guidance, these women transformed both themselves and the societies around them. In post-war hospitals, refugee centers, and rationing offices, former POWs exercised authority not through coercion, but through competence, precision, and ethical leadership. Communities stabilized, operations became efficient, and volunteers followed not out of fear, but respect. Their actions demonstrated that true leadership is validated by results and integrity, not by intimidation or rank. The quiet authority of these women reshaped social norms, subtly challenging long-standing gender roles and perceptions of who could exercise influence in public life. Psychologically, the transformation was profound. Fear gave way to confidence, obedience to initiative, and passive compliance to deliberate action. These women became embodiments of resilience, teaching through example that moral clarity and competence could coexist. Their presence proved that authority need not be performative or coercive. It could be structured, humane, and deeply effective. The broader historical lesson extends beyond the immediate context of post-war Germany. These experiences illustrate the human capacity to rebuild not only infrastructure, but societal confidence. Skill, ethical judgment, and patience became instruments of reconstruction, as vital as food, medicine, or shelter. The story of former POW nurses reminds us that the aftermath of conflict is not measured solely in victories or losses, but in the quiet restoration of dignity, trust, and human potential. Ultimately, the legacy of these women endures as a blueprint for resilience and moral leadership. They transformed themselves, shaped the recovery of entire communities, and left an indelible mark on history. A reminder that courage, clarity, and ethical action can reconstruct societies long after the guns fall silent.